Hi, thank you for joining us on the Odgers Berndtson One Question series. My name is Jules McKean. I run the global media practice for Odgers Berndtson out of London, Executive Search. I'm delighted to be joined today by Andrew Buckman. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Jules.
So Andrew has 25 years in ad tech, and he's worked in scale-ups and turnaround situations across Europe and the US. He recently sold his company to the Azerion Group, which is a Dutch digital entertainment and media platform, where Andrew is now part of the leadership team. He's been through many economic cycles and has experience in building companies as well as making them leaner and more efficient. And given that quite a lot of what he's done is at the intersection of technology and advertising, I think he's very well placed to help us understand the question for this season, which is how well our industry is adapting to the shifting economic situations as we head into 2023. So, Andrew, over to you.
Great. Yes. Well, thanks for inviting me along. So, maybe just a quick word about Azerion, because I know it's one of the bigger companies in our space that nobody's really ever heard of. Yeah. We're basically a digital entertainment and media platform, and we focus on making the distribution and the consumption and then particularly the monetization of digital gaming and entertainment content as scalable as possible. So, as you said, I've been working on this kind of thing for the last 25 or so years. So it's really focused on media and advertising. So I'll kind of dig more into that today, because there's two main aspects that I notice in our sector. Is one is the economic pressure that we get on the companies, and that comes from different areas which all put pressure on the brands and advertisers that we work with, who are either reducing spend because they themselves are having pressure, or because they're actually having supply chain issues, which have been caused by sort of runoffs from the COVID pandemic, but also from sort of chip shortages that we've had in the past. Ukraine at the moment, which is having all sorts of impacts. I mean, most of the steel to make cars comes from Ukraine in Europe, which means that most of the bigger brand advertisers that most of the companies in my space have, there's no point in them advertising anymore because they don't have any cars to sell because they can't actually make them.
And that's a very good point. I didn't think about that. The supply chain impact on the advertiser, it kind of flows all the way through.
Yes, exactly. And it was a surprise to me when I got that from a client to say, well, sorry, we've just cancelled this massive sort of IO because the company doesn't actually have any more cars to sell because they're not building them. So we're having that across all sorts of different lines. I mean, it's even impacting the luxury sector, which is quite a big brand advertiser, where just out of interest, I was in Geneva Airport this week, and I went into the Rolex store there. I said, if I could, or if I wanted to buy a Rolex now, how long's the wait? And he goes, oh, that'll be 8 to 10 months there.
10 months?
Yes.
Not even weeks. Wow. Okay.
No. So this impacts everything. So all of these brands are reducing their advertising because, as the old adage of sort of supply and demand is driving everything, if brands and products are so rare that they don't actually need to advertise because the waiting lists are so long, then that has impact on the media sector.
Yeah.
And then, of course, sort of energy prices is having impact on anyone that has servers and is publishing information on the internet for millions of users to access, because that in itself uses a lot of electricity, and then the cost of that is rising and has to be passed on somewhere. So the companies have their own pressure on that, but then their employees have their own pressure themselves. So inflation in the UK is predicted to get to around 11% this autumn. So a big issue for employees who are finding everything in their life more expensive. They've also been used to working more and more from home over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
You get a lot of employees that are resenting having to pay £6 to £10 a day just for the pleasure of going into work, plus another £6 to £10 a day for buying their lunch if they want to go and get it from the local pret-a-manger. And that overall cost is making their lifestyle cost of living a lot more expensive. Plus general government aspects such as the increase in national insurance. So all of this leads to both distraction from the employees because they're worried about their own financial situation, and in some cases fatigue because they're adding on extra shifts, they're getting second jobs, and they're less focused on their main job, which means they're less effective and efficient for their employer, which means that they're then having onset problems with their customers.
That's really interesting, Andrew. And presumably, does it affect small and large businesses differently, in your view?
Yes, indeed, and it's and I think every company wants to be able to help in whatever situation they can, but as smaller companies generally tend to have a less tangible culture. It's when you go into a larger company, they've had time to think about what their culture is and to distill it into words which are easily retainable, into material, into ways of doing things. Whereas a small company relies more on the personalities of the founders and the personalities of the managers, and really need face-to-face interaction to be able to propagate that culture. Whereas a big company can allocate more resources to have a culture which you can be down on paper and which they can transmit more easily across a hybrid environment. But in both companies, there is a big divide between the leadership of the company and the staff. Leadership tend to have less of an impact because they have more disposable income, because they've got better setup at home, and because the impact of actually traveling to work is going to be less for them than it is for the junior employees.
And when we look then to the future and into next year, I know it's obviously there's an awful lot of constantly shifting economic and geopolitical movements happening. But where do you see for our industry, are there some opportunities, or are there some areas that the companies like Azerion and like the rest within kind of advertising and media technology should be looking to?
Yes, I mean there's ways that actions that the companies can take to better retain their staff, because it is it's an environment where the staff have a lot more choice to be able to go somewhere else. So there's a few sort of really good examples where, like Sky, for example, have just announced they're going to be doing a £1,000 winter payment for most of their UK and Irish staff. John Lewis are giving free food to their delivery staff and their temporary workers over the period, which in media impacts their ability to be able to deliver on the orders themselves. So they'll continue advertising because they know they've got their logistics and supply chain. But then there's other sort of more negative examples where things like Revolut, for example, they recently rescinded a lot of graduate contracts just before they started because they're feeling the crunch. And Twitter are announcing that they're slashing bonuses and that they're cutting the staff annual trip to Disneyland, I think it is. So these are all kind of necessary things to do in this environment. You do have to be leaner and meaner and be more efficient in how you're spending your money, but they need to communicate this better and in a more sort of longer term aspect for their employees. So there's that aspect of making sure that the staff stay on board and not having to spend money to replace. But then there are opportunities in new ways of advertising, in new types of media. There's a lot of in-app gaming, in-app advertising, a lot of gaming advertising. And what's great about those is that they capture the engagement of the users as they're within a game. A lot of these football games or car racing games, they'll have sort of banners and sort of external advertising as you would see when you're actually watching a game on TV, and you can dynamically insert those into advertising. So there's ways of capturing that user engagement and therefore having that user spend for those brands.
That's very interesting, because actually some of those areas may be more insulated against the downturn. If you're competing against, going to the pub's very expensive, maybe people will still continue to game at home with their friends, and therefore that may maintain some of that supply chain and the advertising and demand for products.
Yes.
Interesting. Andrew, thank you very much. Lots to think about there. And it sounds like, kind of from your perspective, the the clarity of communication is really critical with the teams in terms of keeping them on board with why you're making the decisions as companies that you're making in order to survive and thrive in whatever's to come.
Yes, yeah, I think that's definitely the key takeaway. I mean, as we see bellwethers like Facebook and Google, who are also facing the crunch and saying that they've probably got too many people in their organization, they're going to be expecting that kind of message from the other smaller companies. So clear communication, explaining why things are happening, putting everything in context, is definitely the way forward.
Brilliant. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us for the Or Just Learn Someone question. Thank you.
Pleasure.